Via legislation, the Child Care Administration was transferred from the Department of Human Resources to the Maryland State Department of Education in 96 or 97. For several years, a vendor had been developing major IT systems to improve many aspects of CCA, Child Care Administration's delivery of services. As of the transfer of CCA from Human Resources to Education, this IT system was not yet completed. Between the two agencies, because DHR had been handling this for, I think, 4 or 5 years, DHR agreed to retain the responsibility to oversee the implementation of the system and transfer administration to Education once the system was confirmed to work. Okay. Shortly after assuming responsibility for the contract, Department of Education submitted a contract modification for DBM and BPW approval. The modification was for about $600,000 and was described as primarily being needed so that the vendor would maintain the system that DHR had just accepted as meeting the terms of the contract. So it's going to be implemented and accepted by DHR, then transferred to Education, and Education needs to process a modification to maintain the system that had just been accepted. Since it was unusual for a major IT contract not to have a maintenance period, to actually have to do a modification to add it, we asked Education to provide the contract along with the modification signed by the vendor, i.e. we need to look at this because this is very unusual. And Education said, can't give you the contract, DHR didn't give it to us, which was very unusual by itself. Okay, you're supposed to manage the contract, but no, you can't have it. So then we went, Education was asked to sign the modification to accept the transfer between Education and DHR, and had asked for the contract, but DHR had never provided it. So Education had signed an MOU to accept the transfer, but still didn't have the contract that they now were supposedly responsible for. Because DHR wanted relieved of the responsibility for this contract for a unit that was no longer part of DHR, MSDE didn't have much choice but to sign modification even without having the contract to be able to validate things. Upon accepting the contract responsibility, MSDE accepted the vendor's statement that there was no maintenance provision and processed the previously mentioned modification. Everybody, I can't get the contract, the vendor tells me there's no maintenance period, and I know I need one, so I have to do a modification. But we didn't accept the same answer that Education accepted. We didn't accept that DHR doesn't have the contract or isn't going to give the contract. So basically said, we need to see the contract. We want to validate this. And so DHR gave us the contract. And sure enough, when you go through the contract, there was a renewal option for maintenance. And there was a price for maintenance, a $300,000 price to maintain the system for the first year. And you say, $300,000 option under the contract, $600,000 modification to process to add maintenance. Which one do I take? $300,000 option, $600,000 modification. Bingo for option. But then, looking at it, a couple little things were obvious. That the $300,000 detailed the hours of effort to be provided by various of its employees for this price. For the $300,000, we're going to give you X number of hours of this type of person, X number of hours of that type of person, etc. But despite the fixed renewal option price and the detailed level of effort, nothing was identified or required to be done for the price. There was nothing about what are you maintaining? What will we get for $300,000? What will we get for these level of effort of these people? And there's not one word. Of course, it is very hard to be able to comprehend how a vendor could give you not only a fixed price, but break it down by hours of how many people were going to be used to provide this thing, that there was nothing that identified what they were supposed to provide. $300,000 to do what? If there's nothing that says what they're supposed to be doing, how do we know whether we're getting the $300,000 what we're paying for? How do we know we're getting the appropriate level of effort for what we don't know that they're supposed to do? So basically, what we did was say that, as in the previous example, there was no renewal option. Because even though we had a price, and even though we had a breakdown, we didn't know what was supposed to be accomplished for that price with that breakdown, which meant that to be able to find anything else, you had to go back to the vendor and ask them, now what does $300,000 give me? And you have no idea what they told you, whether what they told you would have been what they had intended back like 3 years before when they actually submitted a response to the procurement and quoted that price. So it meant there was no option. We couldn't exercise the option, so the only recourse was to go ahead and process a modification at the price the vendor was quoting, even though now that we had certain other information, we could say, well, you did this before, but anything we said was, well, it was $300,000 before, so why are you quoting $600,000 now? Well, that didn't include this, it didn't include that, it didn't include the other thing. Basically, it didn't include anything. And we couldn't contest what the vendor was saying because there was nothing in either the RFP or the proposal of what was to be provided for $300,000. So it got to the same point. There was no valid option, so it all meant nothing in terms of the ability to exercise an option that seemingly was there but wasn't. So we and then the board accepted the need for the modification at the price demanded by the vendor because the renewal option was determined not valid. The option wasn't valid because it couldn't be unilaterally exercised by the state with all terms and conditions, including what was to be done and the price to do so, contained in the contract with no negotiations needed. Once it is necessary to negotiate with the vendor to flesh out an option in terms of what is to be done under the option or the price to pay for doing so, the requirements for an option to be valid have not been met. It isn't an option. Again, all this should have been discovered before the solicitation for this system was issued or awarded, but since it wasn't, in the perform stage, when they went to exercise an option, well, first of all, they didn't even know there was an option, which I also was very troubled by, that the people who were administering the contract didn't even know there was that provision in it, even though it wasn't valid. They didn't know it was there at all, which is not a good sign when you don't know what's in the contract you're administering.
Joel, sometimes you get contracts like DeWitt gave me a contract to manage, and the vendor said, oh, well, we're increasing our price because of year 2, and I asked DeWitt Procurement, let me see the financial response. Is it true that they included an increase in the price for this year? And they couldn't really give me a straight answer. So, I mean, it happens. It's not that you don't want to be on top of things, but people sometimes don't give you what you need.
Okay. So, I mean, if you don't have the information to validate it, that just evidences that someone wasn't doing the job to begin with. So, all you had the ability to do was acquiesce. The vendor said they're entitled to a price increase. You can't validate if they are or if they're not. So you have two ways to go. You can either say, no, I'm not giving it to you. And maybe that would have been the thing to do. No, I'm not giving it to you, and make them file a claim. And then you say, give me the justification for the claim. But somebody should have the contract. And somebody should be able to read that contract and know either the vendor was entitled to a price increase or not entitled. So, yeah, well, I won't say any more.
Challenges.
Yeah. Maybe, I don't know, maybe the thing would have been, say, to the vendor, unless you give me some kind of justification, I'm not going to give it to you.
That'd probably be the way to go.
And of course, then the vendor can say, you don't give me a price increase, I don't give you services. It can go both ways. And somebody has to have the contract.
Well, I think so, but if they don't want to, if you repeatedly ask them for it and...
I find many things incredible.
Okay.
And as you said, it's negotiable. In that case, it's negotiable. If you're not going to get service, Well, can you negotiate to get the service that's in the best interest of the state?
I realize that probably you're dealing with a non-existent staff, because I don't know when you did this, but they only have like,
Recently.
well, yeah, they don't have anybody left up there. So maybe they couldn't give it to you. Not a good thing. All right, let's see. Options. Now we're going to go to modifications. So any questions on options? What they are, what the standards are, what you can do with them? Anything? All right, modifications. There were two standards to apply to determine if a contract can or should be modified. First standard, is the proposed modification within the scope of the contract? The procurement officer has to make a specific determination that what is intended to be modified is within the scope. And you say to yourself, what does that mean, within the scope? It means it's within the scope. It means it's within the context of the contract. Well, how do I know if it's in the context of the contract? Well, if it's within the context of the contract, if you think it's within the context of the contract, and your attorney agrees that it's within the context of the contract, and no one disagrees with you that it's within the context of the contract. It's like what they say, art is in the eyes of the beholder.
That's right.
Is it within the scope?
Very
And you can get
subjective.
something like, I have been in circumstances where you've had a medical contract where you want to modify it to add an additional medical procedure, and I've had an attorney that says, can't do that because it's not within the scope of the contract. And I'm like, but it's a medical procedure, that's something that needs to be done, and it's just one other thing that certainly could have been in the contract to begin with, but it wasn't specified, so I think it's within the scope, but someone else didn't think what's in the scope. And bottom line is, it's just an opinion.
Very subjective.
It's very subjective. You take, basically, if you ask 3 people, do you think this is something within the scope? And of 3 people, and if they're the right 3 people, all say yes, okay, it's within the scope. And if 2 out of 3 say no, I don't think so, then maybe you'll interpret it isn't within the scope. And the only example I can give is, if you have a contract to do brain surgery, it probably cannot be modified to do pest control services.
Right.
Probably no one would say, yeah, I think that's kind of related to brain surgery. But except for something that drastic of a difference, you frequently can make a case of why something you want to do might be within the scope. And so the procurement officer has to have an opinion, the assistant attorney general has to have an opinion, and the bottom line is it comes down to either the procurement officer or the assistant AG or the agency head. Someone's going to make a decision. If they think it is, or it isn't. If they think it isn't, then you're not going to have a modification, because you cannot do a modification outside the scope of a contract. Cannot modify if it's outside. So if the bottom line decision is it's not within the scope, can't do a modification. And even within the agency, you think that it's within the scope. If you send it to DBM, and we don't think it's within the scope, we won't approve it because it's not within the scope. So that's number 1, has to be within the scope. What that means is it reasonably close to what is currently being done. If so, it may be possible to modify. If the second standard is met, that is on the next slide. If not, if it's not within the scope, the contract cannot be modified in the manner being considered. Lots of times it is clear if the proposed contract changes within the scope. Other times it may not be clear. Something like 6 weeks ago, I wanted to modify the state's. We have a contract with a vendor to give us consulting for the medical contract that we all have for state benefits, Blue Cross and MAMSI and Care First, etc. And wanted to go to them to get some advice on doing something for another department. And my assistant AG didn't think that something that, if they did the exact same thing for DBM, would be covered. I could not modify it to get the same information, the same advice about the same activity for another department. The opinion was, well, our contract, even though it's for the same activity, is for DBM, so we cannot modify a DBM contract to get the same information for another agency.
No,
And I'm like, seems okay to me. But what we did was a small procurement instead, because our lawyer wasn't comfortable with going and doing a modification because she didn't think it was within the scope. And that's just an illustration. I thought it was within the scope. She didn't think it was within the scope. And I said it, and you said, why not? And probably a number of rest of you said, seems like it to me. So you can't tell. Lots of times there's gray areas. The second standard, let's see, which we're not to yet. If it is not clear if a proposed modification is within the scope of a contract, generally consult with your Assistant Attorney General and/or appropriate control agency before contacting the contractor and spending time and effort negotiating the details of the proposed modification. So if there's any doubt, get it rolling first before you go and work out the details, only to perhaps be told later, can't do it. But even if not contacted before a modification is negotiated, generally an assistant AG should approve modification for legal sufficiency. That is bolded because some agencies don't go to their assistant AGs for modifications. And we're telling you, you should. They need to approve modifications. Now here's the second standard. Being able to talk. Does the proposed modification meet the same standards as a sole source award? And that may sound strange to you.
Yeah, what's that mean?
i.e., is the current contractor the only entity that can provide the modification activity? And as I explain this, hopefully it'll become clear why we're saying this. Is it the only entity that can provide the activity either in an absolute sense, it is the only one in existence that does something, or it's the only one that has the legal authority to do something, something of that nature. That's what I mean in an absolute sense. With any degree of reasonableness, and the degree of reasonableness means, well, it may be possible for another entity to do what the modification proposes. One or more of the following would be so much greater for the other entity than for the contractor that as a practical matter, the contractor can be viewed as the only entity that can provide the proposed contract activity. And going back to what's in the middle, one or more of expense, time frame, required effort from the agency, or the expected inferiority of the expected result would be so much greater for anyone other than the existing contractor that it just doesn't make sense to go to anybody else other than the existing contractor. And the reason why I say that it has to be a sole source, because obviously a modification is done with your current provider only. That means you're going to your current provider, and since it's a modification, that means it's not an option, which means you don't have a price, which means you have to negotiate a price. Not only what is supposed to be done, but how much it's going to be charged. And in so many words, if you're coming to them, it's like, who has the upper hand? If we need them to do something, and the question is, give me a price. Okay, you want a price? I'll give you a price. 100,000. We have no idea in most cases whether if we could do that same activity via a competition, could put it out and get responses, whether the price we would get would be 20,000, 50,000, 100,000, i.e. is the vendor making a mint on us for this modification, that they're really making a large profit margin, because we just don't know. We say, what is the price? They give us a price, and usually we say, okay. If there is some way to try to analyze and find out the reasonableness of it, fine, but the bottom line of a modification is, since it has to be mutual, and since generally we're the one that asks for it, as I said before in the example of D.R. Mason, when they asked for a modification, the answer was no. I'm not going to modify the contract to give you more money. So we're the one that's always going to the vendor for these modifications, and the one that's asking is generally the one that needs the activity, and is the one that has the inclination to pay almost whatever is quoted to pay for it. So we're not in a good position when we're negotiating modifications. And before we should do that, go into a situation of only dealing with a single vendor when we're sort of at their mercy, we need to determine they are the only one that in any degree of certainty can do this, because otherwise we should do a procurement to find out who's going to do it and what they're going to charge.
On that example you gave about DBM, the medical services.
Yeah.
Was it going to be similar services for that other department? I mean,
Very similar, yeah.
Because it sounds like you'd have justification on the dollars involved, you just add another department.
Usually I'm the guy that's leading the charge for outside of scope. And this is one I already said, to me, this is within the scope.
Yeah.
And I did not say, well, I can do this exact activity for DBM and it's part of the contract, but if I ask the vendor to do the same activity for another department, since the contract is for DBM, it cannot be extended to another agency. And that's an opinion as to whether it could or whether it couldn't.
And that was the principle.
But there's nothing absolute that says, no, you can't do that. It's just a perception.
You just pick up the number of people on the contract in the other department.
So, but we didn't fight our assistant AG. Plus, the other thing was at the same time, the vendor told us that they didn't want to do it for the other agency anyway.
Oh, okay.
And so we did a small procurement. But if they would have been ready, willing, and able, we still had our AG saying we don't think it's within scope. All right, let's see. So I want to go back and emphasize this. When you submit something to DBM, and before you do that, when you're contemplating doing a modification yourself, you should ask yourself, number one, the first question, do you think it's within scope? And ask your assistant AG, et cetera. And assuming you get a affirmative answer on that, then you ask yourself, can anybody else, any other vendor, reasonably do what I want my current vendor to do? I.e., I won't be losing time, excessive amounts of time. I won't basically have to pay to do the whole thing over again for somebody to learn everything the current vendor already knows. I won't be sacrificing if there's a deadline that something has to be done and we're going to lose federal money if it isn't done by that time. Is it that no one else can do it by that time? That maybe if it weren't for the time frame they could, but we have the time frame. And if we don't meet this time frame, we lose the money. So that is a condition. That is a condition that maybe gets to the point that given all these circumstances, this is the only vendor that can reasonably do what we are seeking to modify the contract to do. And if you don't come up with that answer, that no, if we put this out to bid, someone else can do it probably just as well and perhaps just as quickly and maybe for less money, then you should not even attempt a modification. So if you don't get to this situation of, and this vendor is the only one who can do it with any degree of reasonableness, you put it out for bid instead of doing a modification. And if you don't and you send it down to DBM, that is the standard we will apply for whether we agree to approve that modification. So just telling you what the rules are. Definition. Contract modification means any written alteration in the specifications, delivery point. Specifications, delivery point, date of delivery, contract period, price, quantity, or other provision of any existing contract, whether accomplished in accordance with a contract provision that is already in the contract, i.e. an option technically is a modification because an option is already in the contract. By mutual action of the parties, and this is what we normally call a modification, mutual action of the parties, a change order, and have we discussed, we've discussed it to some degree. Have we discussed it formally? Change order is where the vendor doesn't agree and we say do it anyway, and we'll work out the price later. It includes change orders, extra work orders, supplemental agreements, contract amendments, or reinstatements. And I don't know what a reinstatement is.
The effect of all of those things listed modifies the contract. That's the result. You can call it various different things, but the result is it's a modification to the contract. I think change orders are a bit different.
And that is the definition in 21010201B 26.
Is a suspension a contract modification? That reinstatement made me think of that.
Suspension.
Say no.
Well, let's see. If you didn't change the specifications, if you didn't change the delivery point, if you didn't change the date of delivery, if you didn't change the contract period, didn't change the price, didn't change the quantity, didn't change any other provision, you didn't modify it.
Well, see, he would be suspended because he didn't meet the spec, wasn't doing the job.
If you're suspended, that means they're not supposed to continue to do work until we give you a notice to resume.
That would be the
But it
reason.
doesn't say we're changing any time of delivery or anything else. So my answer would be no, it's not a modification, but who knows? Maybe technically. Yes?
Did you say you could expand or you couldn't expand on the reinstatements?
I said I don't know what reinstatement means. I think I've even asked an assistant AG one time, what does...
And janitorial contracts say when you ask for the monthly price and add alternates.
Yeah?
Well, if you would add alternates based on fund availability, and just say you're getting a pricing up front, but you put somewhere in the contract that says that as funding become available, you may reinstate the add alternates.
Okay. Maybe that's what that means. I don't know.
Okay.
I can't tell you. It sounds reasonable, but I don't know if that's
Have you
what
heard
that
of
means.
Mark?
No, but that does sound reasonable.
Add alternates, we talked about in planning, we talked about in pricing. I don't know if we talk about add alternates here. But the basic concept that she's saying is where you get the vendors to give you, you list a number of activities that you don't know if you can afford to do it. So you ask a vendor to give you actual prices for each of those activities, and you will have the vendor do those activities if there is funding. You say what is the base activity, the base contract activity they must do. So they must do this whole set of activities, give you a price for that activities, and then you may have adult 1, adult 2, 3, etc. And each one will be described as far as what it is. Each one will have a discrete price. And then what you'll say was, depending upon the bid prices that we get, we may have you do the base and number 1, or the base and number 2, or the base 1 and 2. And in the pricing class, we describe that add alternates need to be identified in the order of preference so that you can't play games. In other words, if vendor 1 is low bid for the base and alternate 3, and vendor 2 is the low bid for base and alternate 2, you can't just go and take alternate 3 to get the one vendor if 1 and 2 is cheaper with somebody else. And the only way you can do that is if, in pricing it's described what's allowable and not allowable. But it's possible. What? Mary wants to talk to me?
Everybody okay with the definition? This isn't foreign, is it? Everybody, we've seen these before, right?
Yes.
I mean, let's not beat it to death, right? Not that. All right. Anytime an agency implements a change in contract terms or conditions, even ones that are specifically included in the contract, like options, this action, like I said before, regardless of what we do, the end effect is we're going to modify the contract. So from a practical standpoint, options and modifications are considered as different activities, usually implemented at different times and normally subject to different approvals. All right. There are 2 reasons to modify a contract. Clarify the language, or add or subtract any of the parties' rights or obligations. The ones we normally see, we simply increase quantities or we decrease quantities, right? A lot of, when the budgets were coming out, we were losing money. A lot of times we had to go back to contractors and modify our agreements to reduce the amount of activities we were getting, the quantities of items we were receiving, because we didn't have enough money to do what we originally intended to do, right? Any other reasons for modifications? I think that's it. Now, modifications, unlike a change order, contract modifications are mutually agreeable. So what does that mean? That means we will both come to reasonable terms saying, we'll do this, I need you to do something, we don't have a price for this yet, or I need you to increase this, whatever, here's the situation, we need you to handle it for us, and normally what will happen is you'll give them some sort of a scope, some sort of an estimate, and they'll come back and say, all right, here's what it's going to cost for this to happen. You can bicker about that, but at the end of the day, chances are they're going to do it. You're going to need them to do it. So depending upon the amount of the modification, can we approve that in-house, or do we have to go to the control agency and maybe onto the board to have that fully approved? The two parties must negotiate the exact language, including the price, figures, and/or formulas by which the contract will be changed. Again, normally what happens is you get them on the phone, you say, come on in, we need to discuss something, and/or you give them some sort of an outline that says, here's the situation, here's what we think we need, here's kind of an estimate of what we're looking at, this many man hours, this much of a cost, and they'll come back and we'll debate as to what the final outcome is going to be. The end result is we will both agree upon that this is the quantities, this is the service, and this is the cost of that. And this is when all this is going to take place. This is the preferred type of modification because typically there is no reason for either party to file a claim concerning the nature of the modification. Why? Because you agreed to it. So normally, unlike a change order where change orders basically we can direct the contractor to perform. And we'll argue about this later. But in the meantime, I'm directing you to work. That situation's not mutually agreeable. They'll come back and they'll fight about the cost of me directing them to work, and that will show up as a claim.
What if they refuse to work?
They can't. They don't. They can't. They basically can't. In construction contracts, they can't. If they refuse to work, then you'll take other actions. But they just can't say, no, I'm not going to do that. That's the beauty of a change order. You can direct them to do something. Whereas this is, we'll both mutually agree that this needs to be done, by the way, this is what it's going to cost you. Needed or not needed? Well, this has a bunch of regulations citings here. Let's see what it says. Contractor shall comply with all federal, state, and local laws and regulations applicable to its activities, obligations under the contract. The regulations in effect as the date of the execution of the contract are applicable. A state procurement regulation may not change in any way a contractual obligation that was entered in before the effective date of the regulation. So basically they have to comply, and we can't just informally change anything is what that last one says. We may not change any obligation that was already agreed upon and already entered into. Pointing at that thing and clicking, right? There is no need to try to modify a contract because of a change in regulations, but a contractor is required to abide by all changes in regulations. I don't normally see where changes in regulations will have an effect on my existing contracts, because a lot of the changes in regulations normally will take place after certain dates or won't be applied back onto existing agreements. No modification is needed to require the contractor to comply with such changes. Again, the bottom line is we always include in our contractors is what the first bullet said on the previous slide, which was they got to comply. They got to comply with all federal, state, and local whatever. So it's up to them. It's their responsibility to make sure they're aware of what these changes are and that they're abiding accordingly. What else? Reconciling contradictions. We continue with that. A vendor might be entitled to an equitable adjustment due to a change in law or a non-Title 21 regulation, but the vendor must abide by the change. They still have to abide by the current laws and regulations. But they may come back and say, look, this new requirement's going to cost me some money, and it will have an effect on your contract accordingly. So there may be something that you can work out there as from some sort of an adjustment. If it's not agreed upon, or if it's not warranted, or if the amount of adjustment cannot be agreed upon, the vendor can file a claim. At the end of the day, if they're not happy and we haven't made this a mutual agreement like this, I have to abide by the changes in law, this is going to cost me some money, you're not willing to help me out and cover that cost, I can always file a claim. At the end of the day, they've always got the right to file a claim, which is their legal standing to say, hey, I think I've been cheated or wronged, or I think you owe me something. A vendor can voluntarily agree to modify a contract because of a Title 21 change. They won't do that if they think it's going to have some implication on their bottom line. Such modification might be required as an agency as a condition of exercising a renewal option. We've always got that hammer, right? We need you to apply, this regulation changed. Obviously, you have to comply with this regulation. We're not willing to pay for it, but maybe we can work something out when we exercise the option, right? Or maybe we just don't exercise the option. Maybe we get to that point. Okay? I don't see a lot of this, personally. All right, now we're going to go from mutually agreeable to a one-sided direction. And change orders are a standard clause in term and condition in our construction contracts. This looks like we have a lot of information on change orders. All right, let's see what it says. Anybody working in construction? Anybody in the back row? Anybody doing construction back here? Michael? I can't see you. Raise your hand. Oh, Colleen, how are you? I'm fine. I'm following. You got to raise it up high so we can see it. All right, what's a change order? Like everything else, it's got to be written, right? We've got to put all this down to pen and paper so it's part of the contract file. A written order signed by a responsible procurement officer. Key word is responsible, right? I guess someone of some authority. Directing a contractor to make changes with or without the consent of the contractor. That's it in a nutshell. I am directing you to do the following. And keep in mind why this is in place in construction. You're out there on the job site. You've discovered some sort of a problem. It's a differing site condition. Maybe something's happened that wasn't planned. Unforeseen site condition, a different site condition. All of a sudden, I had asked for 100 cubic yards of this, but now I need 400 cubic yards of this. The contractor says, well, there's your 100 yards. I'm done. I say, wait a minute, there's still a big hole in the ground. I will direct you to put that other 300, and we'll worry about the price at a later date. When you're in the middle of a construction project like that, you don't have time to sit down and negotiate and come to a nice cozy agreement as far as what we're going to do to continue with the project and make sure everybody's happy. In this particular case, I'm sure I've got a price per ton for whatever this material is. I can do the math, add on 300 more tons, whatever the case is. In construction, you're out there, there's lots of things going on. You're on a schedule. You don't have time to negotiate. That's why you simply tell the contractor, do what you're being told to do, and we'll fight about what I owe you later. Or maybe they say, fine, I'll give you another 300 tons or yards or whatever it is. We've already got a price. That price is good for what I've got for this additional quantity. Just do the math and I'll send you an invoice for the additional material. Sometimes it's as easy as that. But the point is you don't have time to bicker and to go back and forth on some sort of a negotiation about, hey, this is what we think we need and how much we think we need. No, I don't care how much we need. Fix the problem. Fill the hole. Let's move on because I've got 4 or 5 trucks backed up behind you until you fix my problem. And a lot of this is because a lot of these changes we'll direct. We're going to tell them, this is our call. We want you to do this. And a lot of it will be due to the fact that we've discovered something that wasn't planned, whether it's a bad site condition or just some condition that we didn't anticipate.
One of the things that appears in our specs is that the contractor is not to do any work beyond the scope of the contract without the
Absolutely.
approval of the director.
Yeah, absolutely. They may come to you and say, look, you asked for 100 and 100's not going to do it, about 150 is going to do it, and frankly, I just put the other 50 in there, and here's the bill for the other 50. I'd say, oh, wait on a minute. Did our project manager approve that other 50? Did my project manager say, yes, we agree? Because they're going to be out there on the scene together. They're going to be looking at the whole saying, yeah, that's not enough. Let's put some more in there, kind of a thing. I don't want to oversimplify, but that's normally how these things happen. The state must be willing to accept the responsibility for the potential financial and other consequences of the contractor's compliance. Hey, I'm directing you to do something. I've got a pretty good idea this is going to cost you more money than you anticipated. I'm going to make you whole. I'll pay for it at the end of the day. We may argue about how much exactly I owe you, but I'm going to pay you. I know I'm on the hook for something. Execute a change order only if a mutual agreement modification cannot be executed. Or you're in construction, it's one of the viable terms and conditions. Obviously, the most preferred route is let's have some sort of a mutually agreeable modification. But if I can't come to an agreement, or if I don't have time to come to an agreement, I will direct you to proceed. I mean, I've always got the right to tell you to proceed. The changes clause in the contract only allows unilateral changes that are within the scope of the contract. I'm dictating the change, and it's within the scope of the contract. A contractor must abide by a change order and perform as directed. They can't just say, no, I'm not going to do it. It's not in the contract. It's not in the requirement. I'm going to say, you shall perform. If not, we've got other hammers to make you do the work, whether it's liquidated damages or bonds or whatever. We've got other mechanisms to make them perform. And they know this going into it. I mean, if they see the changes clause and they're in the business where they're doing modifications or renovations or any sort of construction work, they can almost anticipate these things coming down the line eventually. They know they have to perform, and they know that they're going to get paid for it. Maybe not right away, but they're going to get paid for it. Only within the scope. So again, back to just like modifications, it's got to be within the scope. Contractor must abide and perform as directed unless it's dispute the changes within the scope. He says, look, this is outside the scope. I don't have to do this. Well, we can argue about that. But the contractor can file a claim for higher payments than the agency wants to pay for the change. They can always file a claim, right? Consult with your attorney before issuing a change. You always like to consult with your attorneys before you make these kind of actions, but a lot of change orders are initiated by the project managers out in the field. Yeah, potentially that's a luxury that you may or may not have when it comes to executing these changes, because again, these things are to be done in a more timely manner than just a modification. Change order example. Trying to find what page we're on here. I missed Joel already. We got a housekeeping contract at a small facility. Okay, thanks. Cleaning hours of 7 to 3. The dining area was currently being cleaned in the early afternoon. The facility decided it would be better to have the dining area cleaned at 7 p.m., which is what? 4 hours after what they had been doing it, right? Right. The vendor didn't want to do this. I don't want to be coming back. I don't want to stay. I don't want to do this. It didn't want to modify the contract. Can the facility issue a change order for this? Is my question to the group. Can I?
Changes the scope.
Can I? Yes. Let's not argue. Who says yes? Raise your hands, please. Not many. Who says no? Well, just as few, but everybody else has some sort of opinion. You're just not willing to share it with the group. But let's think about it. Cleaning the dining area, is that with or not within the scope? Who says it's in the scope? Yep. Who says cleaning the dining area is in the scope? Thank you very much. Who says cleaning the dining area at 7 o'clock is in the scope? Nah, there seems to be the conundrum, right, folks? Nope. Joe?
It's not in the scope, but I don't see why the cleaning is in the scope and you can change the hours.
The cleaning is in the scope, so the service itself is in the scope. The real issue is, when is this to be performed? This seems to be outside. Now, I guess the argument is, well, the scope's 7 to 3. Is that the scope? Would that making them do this at 7 o'clock be outside the scope?
It probably is in the spec. It's a 7 to 3 downgrade.
Speaking of outside the scope, Mr. Liebernight. Can the facility issue a change order for this? So we have a split vote. A couple people say yes. Let's see what it says. I think we can agree that cleaning of the dining area is within the scope. So our only question is, they want it done after what was currently in the specifications. Yes, ma'am.
I guess at the point of agreement, they knew that they could have anticipated that they needed the service performed at 7 PM. And my understanding of change orders is that you could not anticipate that change. Just now you mentioned in your example, you know, you go out there, you're building something and you discover that there's a big hole, you have to, they didn't foresee that coming in. But with the 7 PM, that you could have anticipated.
All right, her point was, did they see this coming? Was there something that happened that would prevent them from cleaning between 7 to 3 and they now had to clean it at 7? What unforeseen thing occurred? Or, hey, you know, we just think it would be better if they did it at this time. Maybe it's just a convenience issue. Maybe they were cleaning around people while they were still eating their food or something. I don't know. So did something happen? Was there a legitimate reason why we need this change, or was this just something we would desire? So let's think about what we got. Joel, you don't look too happy, boss. You must have got a good phone call. Maybe.
Issue a change order.
Just like everything else in the other class, I always say, whenever there's a question, the answer is always, it depends. It just depends on what the situation is. All right, let's see what the story is. The issue is whether changing I'm going to read this one because I don't have my glasses on. Changing the working hours is within the scope of the contract. We said that. It's still housekeeping. We said that. But such a change would impose a new set of responsibilities on the contractor. Okay? Suddenly, everybody else goes home at 3, but I got to keep some people around till 7. Or maybe I got to bring some people back at 7. This causes me a little bit of a new responsibility. Because everything now is done by 3, and now they want it done by 7. So this is going to cause the contractor some logistical issues. Okay? We all agree to that, right? So there's normally a price tag attached to that, right? But I think we agree, right? It's still housekeeping. The issue is whether it's within the time specified. Back to the script. The procurement officer was asked to by the facility to intervene. So he calls them in and says, all right, let's find out what's going on. To make the contractor do what was wanted. Only the procurement officer can approve the modifications and issue these modifications, all right? The facility people have all kinds of desires, and they're going to manage the project, make sure things are being clean and bills are being paid, but they don't have the authority to make this type of change to the contractual agreement. Okay? And of course, this change would be subject to whatever internal approvals you may have, including your Assistant Attorney General. And the procurement officer discussed the issue with the contract representative. So everybody's identified what the potential issues are. The person hired would only work part of a shift. This may be without supervision. Difficult to find a person who would just want to come in and work this 7 o'clock shift for a couple hours. Maybe I got to pay this person more because of whatever. Is it fair to order the vendor to do all this? Is there an issue of fundamental fairness here? Is it fair to ask them to do this? It's fair to ask them to do this? Oh, it's not fair.
It's not fair, absolutely.
Since when have we been fair, right? we don't have much compassion. What if the vendor couldn't find somebody to do it? What remedies or incentives and or issues could the facility do to, I want to say, force these people to perform? So these are kind of the issues that are swirling around here, right? What do you think? What do you think? What are we willing to do here? Somebody, what do you think? This is what happened at the end of the day, right? Was readily resolved. Told the facility, so the procurement officer went back to the facility and said, all right, folks, here's what's going on. If a change order was issued, while the vendor is obligated to do the best to comply, it could file a claim for more money. And in this case, we would anticipate that they would be, right? That such a claim would be upheld if it were for a reasonable amount, and we would lose and we would have to pay that difference, okay? The facility said it couldn't pay more money. That is a problem. I think we got an issue here. It wanted to change in the hours, but at no cost. That's kind of like typical of the state, isn't it? We want it all for nothing. So, at the end of the day, they dropped the request, okay? I think that's the reasonable thing to do. I mean, if they forced that contractor to perform, that contractor was going to come back with a, first off, can he? There was an issue of could he even do it, he or she? And secondly, oh, by the way, we're going to do it, and here's what it's going to cost you. So these people said, wait a minute, I can't afford that, or, you know, I don't know the reason why they want to initiate this change anyway, but to think that it would have been done without some sort of fiscal ramification was probably pretty naive on their part, right?
Yep.
All right, 10 minutes. Let's move right along here. Everybody good with this? A theoretical change order situation. And we like these. Let me ask you this, folks, theoretically. Can an agency require a vendor to continue to perform a contract past the scheduled expiration date via a change order if the contractor doesn't want to do so? Let's just drill down a little bit further. Arguably, all activities under the contract would be the same, so you could argue that it's within scope. It is possible that by definition, trying to have a vendor perform services past a scheduled expiration date is beyond the scope of the contract. Almost similar to what we just looked at. We're asking them to do something beyond what we originally had specified, okay? Can we require them to do this? No. Who says yes?
I would say yes. I mean, if you need,
Just a question.
if it's an emergency situation, like for example, construction, not that I know much about it, but if they're needed.
So, I mean, we obviously have a need. We have a need for you to continue, whether it's you're not done what you're doing or it's an operational issue and we need someone to serve food to the inmates every single day, whatever the case may be. What if they just say, no, the contract ends at June 1st and I'm not going past June 1st. I've taken a beating on this contract as it is. I don't want to work one more day than I have to.
Give him incentive.
Give them an incentive. Maybe pay them a little bit more for the extra time on the campus. What'd you say?
I said they're not obligated unless there's a unilateral.
They're not obligated unless there's a unilateral, she says. So in this case, there's no mutual agreement. Right? So is there a changes clause in that contract which will allow me to direct this activity to occur? 9 times out of 10, I can't remember some contract going to a contractor and say, hey, I need you to stay on the job for 3 more months, 6 more months, whatever the extension is, and having them say, no, I don't want no parts of it. Normally they're willing to continue to bill us on a regular basis. But there are some situations where they might just want to say, no, I need to walk away from this for whatever reason. So, can we make them do it? Let's see what it says. The author of these slides, Mr. Liebenite, knows of no situation when a contract was extended by a change order, so it isn't known whether this is a valid application of the change order authority. Likely this is because of the possibility of a claim with an unknown price or performance problems in forcing the vendor to do something it really doesn't want to do. I think that's the risk you have to consider. They don't want to be here, and I'm going to force them to be here. Do you really think you're going to get your money's worth of that, folks? I mean, maybe it's a circumstance you don't have any control over. Maybe you have to say, look, you guys got to stick around for at least another 6 weeks until I can get somebody, whatever, until I can do something else. And they're kicking and screaming and dragging them, you're dragging them along the whole time. And they're giving you poor performance. These are issues you need to think about.
Sounds like an emergency procurement for a short period of time.
That could be an alternative. I mean, if it's truly a situation where they don't agree to do it, they don't want to do it, they're gonna come back and force you to pay them more money to do it, and you don't have language in your document that allows you to direct them to do it. It may be easier just to say, well, let me see what else I can do.
Because there's bound to be somebody out there that will do it.
Most situations, there's always somebody bound who can step in and help you out. The question is, how much time do I have to get them on board? What's the time and expense relative to that? What's the urgency of my need? Is it going to be a continuation of services? There's all kinds of issues out there you got to think about. Most vendors will say, sure, I'll stay on board for another 30 days, but you know what? It's going to cost you an extra $10 an hour. Something like that. And at that point, you can say, well, I'll give you $5. And they'll say, all right, we'll stay. So. All right, last thing we'll touch on today is considerations for modifications. There are things, it's not just as easy as issuing a modification that says, stay on the campus for another 30 days or give me another 40 pounds at X number of dollars, right? Get a new cost and a new price certification. One thing we sometimes forget about if we're adding additional monies onto the value of a contract, do we have funds in place to do that? And can I obtain a certification of the availability of those funds, please, before we go ahead and direct this contractor to continue? Or add it if it's not in the original contract. Don't pay for the same thing twice. Ensure that the intended addition is truly a new requirement and not an existing requirement that's been overlooked. Is it buried in there somewhere in the fine print that says they must do something, and then they come back and say, well, if you want me to do that, it's going to cost you money. So that you need to know your requirements and what the language in that contract is more than they do. Because when they come back with that nonsense, you say, oh, no, wait a minute. That's in this requirement. You're already billing me for that. Insurance or bonds. Your modification may have an effect on your insurance or your bonds. You may have to require new ones and or extend the life of these documents. And MBE, this will have an effect on your MBE because your MBE is based on what? The total value of the contract. So anytime you're increasing the value of the contract, the participation will stay in line with that increase. And at the end of the day, even though you've added $100,000 onto that contract, you still expect the vendor to give you whatever the original stated goal was. Okay? The increase, you don't neglect the MBE just because we've increased the total dollar. Oh, that was in the original contract. Doesn't affect the modification. No, that participation is based on what? The overall contract value, right? Well, thanks for saying hi to my son. He'll appreciate that. And we will open up on Monday with who approves my modifications, okay? Thanks. Have a good weekend.